What if one of the greatest spiritual teachers in human history was never who you were taught to believe she was? What if the story of faith you inherited was carefully crafted, shaped over centuries, to leave someone out, not by accident, but by design? For generations, Mary Magdalene has been reduced to a single image: the repentant sinner, the fallen woman, the one forgiven and quietly placed at the margins. But what if that image is only a fragment of the truth, an edited role meant not only to conceal who she truly was, but to keep you from recognizing something essential within yourself? Beneath layers of doctrine and dogma, beneath sermons and stained glass certainty, there exists another Magdalene, one who was never meant to be a background figure. A woman of deep wisdom, a central presence, a missing piece whose removal has left humanity spiritually blind for thousands of years. Her voice, however, was never fully silenced. It still echoes through forbidden gospels and hidden texts, fragments buried, dismissed, or declared dangerous. In those ancient whispers, Magdalene speaks of the soul's ascent, of liberation from unseen forces, and of a path to the divine that does not begin in temples, institutions, or priests, but within you. So why was her story rewritten? Why was her sacred number 13, a number linked to her name, to lunar cycles, to the rhythms of the feminine, deliberately transformed into a symbol of fear and misfortune? Perhaps because the truth she carried, truths of balance, union, and remembrance, still hold the power to awaken humanity. Deep down, something within you has always sensed that the official story of Mary Magdalene was incomplete. Because some truths cannot be fully spoken, they can only be felt. That is why you are here, and perhaps you are beginning to remember a deeper history, one that was hidden in plain sight. As we uncover the fragments of Magdalene's suppressed teachings, the wisdom the Church struggled for centuries to bury, we will explore her vision of a forgotten divine union and discover why her presence and message matter now more than ever. What you are about to hear is not simply another retelling of her story, it is a mirror. And in that mirror, you may glimpse the missing piece, not only of the story of Christ, but of your very soul. There is a moment in every life when a quiet question rises, often uninvited, often uncomfortable, asking whether the story you inherited about truth, faith, and yourself was ever meant to be complete. It is from that question that we must begin, because to approach Mary Magdalene is not to study a historical figure, but to step beyond the stained glass certainty that shaped her image and enter a much older, more fluid landscape of memory and meaning. The Magdalene most people were taught to see is a simplified silhouette, a woman defined by what was removed from her rather than what she carried. Yet the earliest followers of Jesus encountered someone far more complex and far more central. In the canonical Gospels, she appears at moments where meaning is densest and silence is loudest. Present at the crucifixion when fear scattered almost everyone else, attentive to the place where the body was laid, and first to witness the resurrection itself. These are not accidental placements, they are narrative thresholds. And it is worth pausing here, gently, without accusation, to feel the weight of a simple question. If she were insignificant, if she were merely a forgiven sinner placed there for contrast or moral instruction, why do all four Gospels agree that she, and she alone, was the first to see what others could not yet perceive? Before Peter, before John, before those later elevated as pillars of authority, it is Mary who sees, remembers, and speaks. That detail lingers like an unresolved note, especially when we allow ourselves to step outside the official frame and listen to other voices that survived only in fragments. In the Gospel of Mary, a text buried in the sands of Egypt and brought back into the light in 1896, a different Magdalene emerges, not as an object of pity or correction, but as a bearer of understanding. After the teacher's departure, while the disciples tremble before the world and its powers, It is Mary who rises, not with command, but with clarity, offering words meant to steady the soul rather than enforce obedience. She speaks of things unseen yet deeply familiar, of inner movements rather than outer rules, and in doing so she unsettles those who were already leaning toward hierarchy and control. The Gospel of Philip moves even closer to the tension beneath the surface, calling Mary the companion of Jesus, a term that suggests partnership in shared mysteries rather than romance or scandal, and hinting at a closeness that stirred resentment among the other disciples. These texts do not read like marginal footnotes. They feel like threads cut from a larger tapestry, threads that once carried a vision of spiritual life, rooted not in submission, but in recognition. To understand why those threads were removed, it helps to remember that early Christianity was not a single voice speaking in unison, but a storm of competing visions struggling to define what salvation meant. Some paths emphasized obedience, law, and external authority, while others, often later labeled Gnostic, spoke of salvation as knowledge, not information but remembrance. An awakening of a divine spark already present within the human soul. Mary Magdalene's voice aligns unmistakably with this second current. In the surviving fragments of her gospel, she describes the soul's ascent as a journey through inner realms, confronting forces that attempt to bind it through fear, ignorance, and desire, and discovering freedom not through compliance, but through knowing. For a movement drifting toward empire, structure, and centralized power, these ideas were quietly destabilizing. A woman suggesting that true authority arises from within, that no rigid hierarchy is required to touch the divine, was not simply offering an alternative theology. She was embodying a different center of gravity. Even the symbols associated with her tell a similar story. In certain traditions, Magdalene is remembered as the 13th apostle, standing just beyond the 12, carrying something that could not be easily contained within established order. Her initial, M, is the 13th letter of the alphabet. In ancient cultures, 13 was not feared but honored, associated with lunar cycles, hidden months, and the rhythms of the feminine, a number of transformation rather than misfortune. Over time, that symbolism was inverted, and what once pointed to renewal and balance became an omen to be avoided. This shift was not merely numerical. It mirrored a deeper cultural movement away from inner knowing and toward external control. Magdalene, in this sense, becomes more than a historical figure. She becomes a living symbol of Gnosis, of a spirituality that resists confinement, of a wisdom that does not announce itself loudly, but persists beneath the surface. Across centuries, her image was gradually reshaped, from teacher to penitent, from witness to warning, from bearer of insight to background figure, until the memory of what she represented seemed almost to disappear. Almost. Because truth, especially when it speaks to something essential in the human soul, has a way of surviving in quiet forms. It survives in fragments of parchment, in whispered traditions, and in the persistent unease felt by those who sense that something vital has been left out of the story they were given. And perhaps that unease is not accidental, but a quiet opening. Because if Magdalene carried a vision that was set aside, the question may not yet be what it means for us, but why such a vision was allowed to fade at all, and what kind of world needed it to remain unseen, and what it might mean to listen again, carefully, as we move closer to the heart of her hidden teachings. If you follow that unease a little further, allowing it to open rather than closing it with certainty, you arrive at a quiet but unsettling realization. The story that survived was shaped as much by fear as by faith, and the teachings that faded were often the ones that asked too much of the inner life. In the fragments attributed to Mary, what remains is not a system but a movement of consciousness, a map drawn not across land or law, but across the interior terrain of the soul. In her account, after the teacher is gone and the familiar structures collapse, the disciples are not instructed to build institutions or enforce belief, but to face their own terror of the world, their dependence on authority, and their longing for safety. It is in that vulnerable space that Mary speaks, not to command but to remind, describing a vision in which the soul rises through unseen realms, encountering forces that attempt to claim ownership over it. These forces do not roar like monsters. They speak in familiar voices. They ask where the soul thinks it is going. They insist it belongs to them. They whisper that freedom is impossible, that boundaries are fixed, that fear is permanent. The language is symbolic, yet uncomfortably intimate, because these voices are not external demons, but inner conditions the soul must recognize without mistaking them for its own essence. What later tradition named the 7 demons cast out of her appear here as garments of consciousness: craving that narrows perception, ignorance that dulls awareness, fear that paralyzes movement, arrogance that hardens identity, desire that binds the future to endless lack. In this telling, the miracle is not an act of domination over darkness, but an awakening that renders darkness transparent. The soul is not rescued by force, it remembers itself, and that remembering changes everything. When Mary speaks of liberation, she does not describe obedience to new laws or submission to hidden authorities. She speaks of an inner clarity that loosens the grip of these forces, allowing the soul to answer their demands with a simple recognition: I was never owned. I was never bound. This is not defiance in the political sense. It is not rebellion for its own sake. It is a shift in identity, from seeing oneself as a subject under control to recognizing oneself as a participant in something larger and more alive. Such language would have felt deeply destabilizing in a world moving toward hierarchy, empire, and standardized belief. It quietly removes the need for intermediaries. It suggests that the divine is not distant, guarded, or scarce, but immediate and intimate, encountered not through compliance, but through awareness. In one striking passage, Mary warns against replacing living truth with rigid structure, urging that no new laws be imposed beyond what was already given, not because order is evil, but because fixation hardens what was meant to remain fluid. The danger she points to is subtle. When certainty is handed over too quickly, something subtle happens inside. The soul grows quieter, and its own sense of direction is slowly deferred. This is not framed as a condemnation, but as a gentle caution, offered at a moment when the future of the movement was still undecided. It is perhaps no surprise that this voice met resistance. In the text, Peter questions her openly, not attacking her message outright, but questioning her right to speak it. Did these teachings really come to her? Should the group listen to a woman? The tension here is not only personal, it reflects a deeper conflict between two orientations toward truth, one that seeks stability through structure, and another that trusts transformation through insight. Levi's defense of Mary does not elevate her above others. It simply asks a devastatingly simple question: if the teacher found her worthy, who is anyone else to deny her voice? In that moment, the struggle is laid bare. Mary represents a path that cannot be easily regulated. It does not gather power by accumulation. It disperses it by awakening. History tends to remember which path prevailed, but it also remembers, in quieter ways, what was lost in the process. As the centuries unfolded, voices that emphasized inner knowing were gradually overshadowed by those that prioritized unity through doctrine. What remained of Mary's vision survived mostly in symbol and myth, encoded rather than declared. Yet symbols have a way of slipping past censorship. The image of ascent, the journey through inner realms, the confrontation with binding forces, these patterns reappear across traditions, suggesting not a borrowed story, but a shared interior experience. They speak to moments when you feel caught between who you have been and who you sense you could become. Moments when familiar identities begin to feel too small and something wordless urges you forward. This is where the story becomes uncomfortably personal, because the forces Mary describes are not relics of an ancient cosmology. They are present whenever fear convinces you that change is impossible, whenever desire promises fulfillment while quietly postponing it, whenever authority tells you that your own perception cannot be trusted. To listen to her teaching is not to reject the world, but to engage it differently, no longer as a prisoner of inherited narratives, but as a participant in an unfolding awareness. And this is precisely why her voice was difficult to preserve in its original form. A spirituality that begins within cannot be easily standardized. It asks each person to take responsibility for their own awakening, not in isolation, but in a way that cannot be outsourced. Yet despite being rewritten, reduced, and reframed, the core of her message persists, not as doctrine, but as resonance. You may feel it as a quiet recognition, a sense that the struggle you experience between conformity and authenticity is not merely psychological, but symbolic of something older and deeper. In that sense, Mary's vision does not ask for belief or rejection. It simply lingers, creating a tension that cannot be resolved by agreement or dismissal, only by noticing what it stirs beneath the surface. And if you allow yourself to look into that mirror without rushing to conclusions, you may begin to sense why this story has never entirely disappeared, and why it continues to surface at moments when old structures feel hollow and the longing for inner truth grows impossible to ignore, drawing us toward the final layer of what her presence came to embody. As that mirror lingers before you, the figure of Mary Magdalene begins to shift once more, no longer confined to texts or debates, but unfolding as a living symbol of something the human story has long struggled to hold in balance. Beyond the arguments over authority and doctrine, beyond questions of who was right or wrong, she comes to embody a principle that is older than any institution, and yet endlessly renewed within those who dare to listen inwardly. In the early shaping of the tradition, one path was elevated as the spine of order, associated with structure, obedience, and continuity, while another path, quieter and more elusive, carried the language of intimacy, intuition, and inner recognition. These two currents were never meant to be enemies. They were meant to move together, like breath and heartbeat, like night and dawn. When one was amplified and the other muted, something essential went out of tune. The loss was subtle at first, then generational, and eventually it felt normal to seek the sacred only at a distance. Mary's presence disrupts that distance. In the Gospel of Philip, she is called a companion, a word that points not to possession, but to shared participation in mystery. It suggests a meeting of understanding, a resonance rather than a hierarchy. This closeness unsettled those who measured legitimacy by rank and visibility, because it hinted at a form of knowing that could not be controlled. Some Gnostic traditions spoke of the bridal chamber, not as a physical rite, but as an inner union, a symbolic space where divided aspects of the self are brought back into coherence. Masculine and feminine, action and receptivity, light and wisdom no longer stand opposed but recognize themselves as expressions of a single movement toward wholeness. In this sense, Magdalene does not merely learn from the teacher. She reflects the teaching, embodying it in a way that makes separation impossible. This is not romance in the modern sense. It is cosmology made intimate, a reminder that transformation occurs not through domination, but through integration. Her lineage, as remembered in later mystical imagination, reaches even further back, touching older streams of reverence where the body was not seen as an obstacle to the sacred, but as its vessel. The red garments, the alabaster jar, the gestures of anointing, All echo priestly roles associated with initiation, healing, and passage. These symbols speak of life force, of thresholds, of the capacity to hold both vulnerability and power at once. To authorities invested in clear boundaries and fixed roles, such imagery was difficult to contain. A woman who carried echoes of ancient wisdom into a new spiritual language challenged more than theology. She challenged the very way meaning was organized. And so the story bent. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the Magdalene of insight became the Magdalene of repentance. The teacher became a cautionary figure. The witness became a warning. This was not done through open hostility, but through repetition, through selective emphasis, through the quiet power of omission. Over time, what could not be integrated was recast as something to be corrected. Yet even as her image was narrowed, the archetype she carried remained intact beneath the surface. In esoteric traditions, in poetry and art, in the persistent fascination with her figure, Mary Magdalene continued to appear as the lost bride, the keeper of wisdom, the feminine face of a truth that refused to remain singular. Some spoke of her as the counterpart, without which the divine story felt incomplete, because in many ancient understandings, no savior, no God, no principle of light could stand alone. Completion required reflection. Balance required relationship. Philosophically, this places her not as an exception, but as a reminder. She points toward a mode of knowing that is experiential rather than inherited, tasted rather than explained. She suggests that the sacred is not something you approach from a distance, with caution and credentials, but something you encounter directly, through attention, through presence, through the willingness to meet yourself without armor. This is where the story becomes quietly confrontational, not because it attacks belief, but because it asks something more demanding. It asks you to notice the voices that rise when you consider claiming your own inner authority, the questions that say you are not qualified, not pure enough, not permitted to speak of the divine without permission. These voices are ancient. They echo the same resistance Mary faced, reframed in modern language. To engage her story symbolically is to recognize that the struggle between conformity and authenticity did not end in the first centuries. It unfolds in every life where the pull of belonging conflicts with the call of inner truth. Her erasure was never complete because what she represents cannot be fully removed. Archetypes do not vanish, they wait. They surface when conditions are right, when old structures feel too tight, when meaning begins to leak from forms that once held it securely. If this story feels strangely close, if it seems to brush against your own questions about purpose, authority, and freedom, that closeness may be the point. The teachings associated with Mary Magdalene were never meant to be collected like doctrines. They were meant to be lived as inquiries. They invite you to consider where you have handed your knowing to others, where fear has convinced you to remain smaller than you are, where desire has kept you circling the same patterns while promising fulfillment just out of reach. They also offer a different possibility, one that does not demand certainty, but encourages awareness. To see with what she called the eye of the heart is not to escape the world, but to engage it without losing yourself inside it. When the soul recognizes the forces that seek to bind it, not as enemies but as conditions to be understood, something loosens. The simple recognition that you were never owned, never fully defined by inherited stories, carries a quiet power. It does not overthrow systems, it changes orientation. And that shift, once felt, cannot be unseen. Mary Magdalene's story endures because it gestures toward that shift without insisting on its form. It leaves space. It trusts the listener. It does not claim to replace one certainty with another, but to reopen a question that was prematurely closed. In doing so, it returns responsibility to where it has always belonged, not to institutions or intermediaries, but to the living awareness within each person. The invitation is not dramatic. It is subtle and therefore more demanding. It asks whether you are willing to stand at the threshold between what you were told and what you sense, between the comfort of answers and the vitality of inquiry. If you are, then the Magdalene who was hidden begins to feel less like a figure from the past and more like a presence that accompanies you, quietly, as you reconsider the shape of your own becoming. Her story has been moving alongside yours this entire time, not as a lesson to master, but as a rhythm you may have felt beneath the words. A quiet recognition that the tensions you carry between conformity and authenticity, between outer voices and inner knowing, are not personal failures, but ancient crossings many have walked before you. Nothing you felt while listening was accidental. The questions that surfaced, the moments of resistance or resonance, the sense of something loosening or settling, all of it belongs to the same unfolding that kept Magdalene's presence alive, even when her name was softened, narrowed, or set aside. What was buried was never lost. It simply waited for the right season to be felt again. If certain images stayed with you, if certain phrases seemed to echo longer than others, that does not mean you are late or behind. It means you are arriving exactly where you need to be. The path described here was never about effort or achievement, never about reaching higher or becoming something else. It has always been about remembering what has quietly remained intact beneath the layers you learned to wear. The obstacles named along the way were not meant to be fought or defeated, only seen for what they are, familiar patterns that lose their grip once they are recognized without fear. If you noticed moments of fatigue giving way to stillness or urgency softening into clarity, that shift matters. It suggests that something in you already knows how to rest inside the question without rushing toward an answer. There is no need to hold on to everything you heard. What belongs to you will stay. What does not can fall away without consequence. You are not required to decide anything now, and there is nothing you need to fix or prove. The movement you are in unfolds at its own pace, aligned with the season you are living, not with anyone else's expectations. If the story felt close, if it seemed to speak quietly rather than convincingly, that intimacy is part of the design. These reflections were never meant to replace what you believe, only to create enough space for you to sense what is already alive beneath belief. As you settle back into your own rhythm, trust that the awareness stirred here will continue to shape itself gently, without pressure. And when you are ready, the thread we have been following does not end here. It continues, waiting just beyond this moment, where the next layer of remembering naturally begins to reveal itself.